Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of history and heritage of the British Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, including this book today, visit the cafe, donate, or become a member, where you get your own exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I am delighted to welcome Barnaby Phillips. Barnaby has spent more than 25 years as a journalist, reporting for the BBC from Mozambique, Angola, Nigeria, and South Africa, before joining Al Jazeera English. He is the author of Another Man's War, the story of Burma Boy and Britain's Forgotten African Army, and Loot, Britain and the Benin Bronzes. Today, Barnaby will be exploring the fascinating forgotten history of the British Army and the missing gold treasures of the Ashanti. There will be time for questions at the end of the talk. Please, for both our in-person and online audiences, for our online audiences, post questions in the chat bar, and these will be put to the speaker at the end. In-person audiences, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you. Moving on to some technical points. If we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us whilst we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes online, we suggest refreshing your browser. That solves most issues. With all that said, I'll pass over to Barnaby. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. Barnaby.
Thank you, everybody, for coming on such a filthy day. I'm very touched. This talk is based on the research of my new book, The African Kingdom of Gold, Britain and the Ashanti Treasure, which comes out at the beginning of March, but hot off the press, there are copies in the bookshop today. I only received a copy yesterday, so they're smoking hot. The book looks at the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, the looting of the Ashanti gold regalia, and some of the issues around restitution, colonial loot, and what our museums should do about it, if anything, today. And that's what I'll talk about during my talk. But I'll focus a little bit more on the 1874 British invasion of Ashanti, which I think was perhaps the most dramatic, the most consequential moment of many dramatic moments, and also because I am in the National Army Museum, the most significant British military deployment in these wars. Ashanti, 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 Kumasi, 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 spelt in different ways. Ashanti means the people and the kingdom. Kumasi is the capital city. Lots of spelling you'll see in the historiography. They all mean the same thing, but the most common spelling today, if I can get the clicker to work there, Ashanti spelled A-S-A-N-T-E, and Kumasi, the city, K-U-M-A-S, K-U-M-A-S-I. Where are we talking about? Forgive me if you know all this. This is West Africa today, and we're talking about the country of Ghana, a British colony called the Gold Coast until independence in 1957. And you can see Kumasi there just by the green dot, an inland city, the second city of Ghana today. Ashanti rises, that inland kingdom, in the early 18th century. It has a formidable military, and its wealth derives from the slave trade, above all with Europeans who are on the coast, and the gold, of course, hence the Gold Coast. And at its zenith, which is probably the late 18th century, early 19th century, it controls a lot of what is today Ghana. Think of it as a confederation, a central kingdom in Kumasi and affiliate kings on the periphery. And the degree of control which that central king, the Asante, has over the periphery ebbs and flows with the fortunes of the empire. This is the great creation myth of the Ashanti. You may have heard of the golden stool, Sika Dawa. The Ashanti say it was conjured from the sky by the great priest Okomfo Anoche, and it contains the soul of the Ashanti people. And it is presented to the first Asante, the first Ashanti king, Ose Tutu. This is round about 1700. The golden stool is still there today. It retains its mythical status, its mystical status, and the unity and the well-being of the Ashanti people still depend on it. It's displayed very rarely in public. A tight group of palace courtiers in Kumasi know where it is kept. Nobody may sit on it, not even the Asantehene. It must never touch the ground, and when it does appear, it has its own throne to the left of the Asantehene. And here is today's Asantehene, Osei Tutu II in Kumasi, because despite the history I'm about to recount, the dynasty is still very much intact. Osei Tutu II took the throne, or I should say correctly, was installed in 1999, and he is the 16th Asantehene. Let's rewind back to 1817. And this is when the British, who have been on the coast since the 16th century and in a more serious way since the 17th century when they take possession of a place called Cape Coast and build a castle there, are starting to become much more interested in the interior. The British, the Portuguese, who were there first, the Dutch, the Danes, the French, the Brandenburg Germans, the Swedes, I may have left someone else out, they've jostled along this Gold Coast. They each have their own little fort, their own little castle. And they trade through middlemen, the Fanti people typically, who live on the coast, for these two great commodities. Gold at first, hence the name, which comes from the interior, and slaves. And of course, Britain in the 18th century is a very enthusiastic, is the leading transatlantic slaving power. By the beginning of the 19th century, you'll know, British policy has undergone a dramatic volte-face, and we are fervent abolitionists. And we are starting to become keen to establish our own direct links with this powerful inland kingdom, which we know so little about. And so it is that a man called Thomas Bowdich, an apprentice hatter from Bristol, and a group of other officials set off on this march into the almost unknown interior. It's about 200 kilometers. It takes them a month. They pass many desolate villages on the way, but they are received by Osei Bonsu, the Asantehene of the time. And Bowdich leaves us a description of an impressive city with striking architecture. He writes a best-selling book, From Cape Coast to Ashanti, published in 1819 and still widely quoted today, not just by foreign scholars of the Anglo-Ashanti War like me, but in fact by Ashanti scholars as well. It is an incredibly detailed and interesting book, and I think it impacts the British imagination. It's met with some excitement and some skepticism here in London, but it establishes the idea in the British imagination that Ashanti is the kingdom of gold. This is what Thomas Bowdich says when he enters Kumasi. An area of nearly a mile in circumference was crowded with magnificence and novelty. The king, his tributaries and captains were resplendent, surrounded by attendants of every description. The sun was reflected with a glare scarcely more supportable than the heat from the massy gold ornaments which glistened in every direction. At least 100 large umbrellas or canopies, which could shelter 30 persons each, were sprung up, of the most showy cloths and silks, crowned with crescents, pelicans, elephants, barrels and arms, and swords of gold. Thomas Bowdich succeeds in signing a treaty of friendship with the Asantehene. Unfortunately, he dies only 7 years later on the River Gambia on another expedition to Africa. His wife, Sarah, is left destitute with children, and she might be an even more remarkable person given the circumstances of the day, because she actually becomes a successful author and botanist and zoologist. So I think somebody needs to write a joint biography of the Bowdich couple. It's an extraordinary life they led. But unfortunately, as regards Ashanti, theirs is not a lasting achievement. This is a brief honeymoon of Anglo-Ashanti friendship, because by the 1820s, the first Anglo-Ashanti War, a series of wars which incredibly will go on into the 20th century, has begun. And this is when the newly arrived British governor, a man called Sir Charles McCarthy, is decisively defeated by the Ashanti, at the Battle of Nsamanko. And this is an absolute lesson in hubris. He marches into the interior. Everything goes wrong, disease, mud, his intelligence is faulty. He's leading the newly formed Royal African Corps. We were basically West Indian soldiers who've been shipped in from Sierra Leone and various local allies of varying degrees of enthusiasm. McCarthy is defeated and he is decapitated. And without wanting to get too grisly, the quest to retrieve his head is an enduring theme of the Anglo-Ashanti Wars and something which exercises British soldiers an awful lot in the later 19th century. Is the head still in Kumasi, or is it in fact in a church in Devon? You'll have to read my book to find out. Spoiler alert, I'm not exactly sure which, but those are the two most credible theories. But what you see here, in fact, is the great British victory which follows 2 years later in 1826 in a place called Katamanso, where the British, with those local allies who are a bit more motivated this time, inflict a great defeat on the Ashanti. Perhaps the Ashanti have made the mistake of coming out of the forest to the interior, and this is on the coastal plain just outside Accra, which today is the capital of Ghana, Katamanso, also called Dodowa. After which, the story of the 19th century, up until 1870, which we're going to reach in a moment, is one of interludes of peace, but broadly speaking, Anglo-Ashanti relations are often tense for a number of reasons, I would say. The British are pulled into conflicts in support of the Fanti and their other coastal allies with whom they have much closer relations, and most of whom regard the Ashanti as feared enemies. British commercial interests, of course, are growing, and as the 19th century goes on, British imperialism becomes more aggressively expansionistic, although I should say that this process is often slow and hesitant, often a case of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And the Ashanti as well are seen as an obstacle to British economic ambitions. Related, of course, to that growth in imperialist expansion is a fear and a desire to keep the French and the Germans out, that if we don't establish our control, European rivals will, so we have to get there first. And you might feel more credibly, the British are also opposed to the slave trade throughout the 19th century and to the practice of human sacrifice. And this brings a moral element to British foreign policy, which I would say is combined with a heightened sense of racial superiority as the 19th century goes on, and gives them a conviction and a confidence to what they are doing. So I think that is the sort of social, cultural, political background to the Ashanti Wars. And that brings us to the events of the 1870s. In 1871, the British buy this building, the great castle of Elmina on the Gold Coast, built by the Portuguese back in 1482. They buy it from the Dutch, despite the Ashanti insistence that it belongs to them. This means the British are now the last remaining power on the Gold Coast. They've brought out the Danes a few years earlier, the Dutch have gone, and now it is only the British and the Ashanti inland. And that means that the Ashanti access to the coast, which is so important to this powerful inland kingdom, is now impeded by what it regards as a hostile power. And of course, the Ashanti themselves have had good relations with the local king, the King of Elmina. So the British buying this fort is a huge setback to the Ashanti. In 1873, to the horror and the surprise of the British, an Ashanti army sweeps south into the rather ill-defined Gold Coast Protectorate, which the British run along the coast. They're ordered to invade by the Asantehene, a man called Kofi Karikari, and in fact they reach the walls of Elmina Castle, and this is a stunning reversal for the British at the hands of what they call a barbarian foe. 12,000 Ashanti soldiers, mostly armed with muskets, what they call Dane guns. In Britain, the politicians, Gladstone is the Prime Minister, prevaricate. They send some West Indian soldiers. They send about 100 Royal Marines. But it is this man, Sir Garnet Wolseley, on the left. That's his tomb on the right. Some of you might know it. It's in the crypt in St. Paul's, a stone's throw from Nelson and Wellington. A huge figure in late 19th century military history, and all but forgotten, I think, to the general public today, who seizes the initiative and pushes right from the beginning for more decisive action, and I think senses personal opportunity. He wants to inflict a decisive defeat on the Asante Kofi Kari. He's already a rising star of the army. He comes from an Anglo-Irish military family. He's been in Burma, in India, in China, in Canada. He's seen plenty of action. He's a supporter of the Cardwell reforms, and I think there'll be army experts who know more about them here than I do, but basically that is to do with the professionalism of the army, and an Ashanti war is a chance for him to show his expertise on logistics and planning. Remember, this is still at the infancy of telegraph communications, so any communication with London, in fact, still takes weeks. West Africa is not yet online, and so if you get out there, you have the scope to shape events to your own initiative, to your own ambition, if you like. And he absolutely knows that. He's determined to have British soldiers. He does have a circle of hand-picked officers around him, the so-called Wolseley Ring, and he pulls off a coup. He doesn't quite get the hand-picked regiments, which he wanted, but he does get 3 British battalions sent out. So they're the 42nd Highlanders, the Black Watch, a battalion from the Rifle Brigade, and the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. So about 2,500 soldiers are sent out from Britain to fight, potentially, in the West African tropical interior, which is an extraordinary moment in British military history. It's true, a British army has invaded Magdala, Abyssinia, on a huge expedition 4 years earlier, but lots of those soldiers were Indian, and although the terrain in Abyssinia is formidable, one might say that the climate, from a British point of view, was much kinder. West Africa is still the white man's grave. It is a place where malaria, and the connection with mosquitoes has not even been made yet, incidentally, dysentery and typhoid all lead to the most extraordinary and appalling mortality rates. So that's one of the risks which he has to overcome. He invades Ashanti in the first weeks of 1874. They march up the route you can see, the line up the middle there, all the way to Kumasi. It's a tremendous logistical undertaking on foot. There is some talk of building a railway, but it's quickly abandoned. They're going through thick jungle, thousands of porters carrying guns and ammunition, many of them brutally press-ganged into service. Now, there is an enormous historiography of this war, and some of you might be familiar with it. It really is a Victorian melodrama that captured the public's imagination. I had one incredible stroke of luck, which was that I was able to use this never before used diary from an acting corporal, a man called George Little, and it is full of candor and color. It's some 50 pages long. I can't claim the credit. It was curators at the V&A, a man called Angus Patterson, who found it. Its origins are mysterious, but it is a treasure trove. So do get to the V&A Art Library and see what George Little has to say. It's very, very colourful. There's a nice undertone of subversiveness and irony as well, and it's immensely readable. Or check out the edited highlights in my book as well. But I think from the National Army philosophy of the perspective of the ordinary soldier, George Little's Diary of the Ashanti War is an extraordinary publication. The British enter Ashanti territory, which means they cross the Pra River unopposed. And here they are in their first substantial settlement on the other side of the river, a place called Femena. Sometimes people see this palace and say that it's British soldiers going around the palace in Kumasi in the capital. I think it's actually a couple of weeks before it's in Femena. But it gives an idea of the sophistication, the unexpected sophistication of the kingdom that they are invading. The fighting does come a few days later, and principally here at the Battle of Amoafo, where the Ashanti stage not quite the last defense, but the penultimate defense of their kingdom. Now, the British, as some of you will know, have huge advantages. They have the Snider breech-loading rifle. We're not quite in Maxim gun territory yet, but they do have the Gatling gun, and it is enough to inflict great slaughter on the Ashanti and negate the Ashanti advantages of fighting in the forest, at which they are great experts, and their courage, and indeed their organization. The white men have guns which hit 5 soldiers at once, says a bewildered Ashanti General Amankwa Tia when he gets back to Kumasi from an earlier encounter. Henry Morton Stanley, yes, him, the man who discovered Livingstone, who is one of the rather lively press corps who's accompanying Wolseley, and with whom Wolseley has a rather interesting love-hate relationship, says that there were ghastly heaps of rent bodies and disfigured corpses. This is George Little, that man I was alluding to. Again, we poured volleys, rockets, shells into them, but they would not give way for some time. The slaughter must have been fearful on their side, as we passed a great number of dead, lying in heaps shot down. Still they advanced bravely. As one body was shot down, another would take its place. It seemed a pity to touch these brave fellows, but they would not be taken prisoners and seemed to court the death they received. The estimates of how many Ashanti soldiers vary wildly, as you would imagine, anywhere between 800 and into the low thousands. 4 British soldiers were killed. But I think the discrepancy between those figures is a little bit misleading. There is very, very ferocious fighting, which lasts all day. There are many British injuries. Wolseley says, I have taken part in most of the wars we've had for the last 22 years. In none have I met with a braver enemy. He also says later that if the Ashanti had had Snider's rifles, the British would have lost. Nonetheless, the British do enter Kumasi, and the Asantehene, Kofi Kari, has fled, which is incredibly frustrating for Wolseley. He is like Napoleon in Moscow. He's won, but there is no king to surrender to him. And the weather, in this case, of course, not the Russian snow, but the West African rains, are closing in. That means sickness, and it means his return routes are going to be impassable, he fears. His Royal Engineers have built an incredible 237 bridges on the route up to Kumasi, so time is not on his side. He decides to make a statement. He sets fire to the city of Kumasi. Much of its roofs, of course, are thatch. This is not easy. It takes a dedicated effort by the British because the rains have begun and many of the roofs are sodden. And he destroys this building, the King's Palace, which the Royal Engineers work all night to dynamite. This is what Sir Garnet Wolseley says about what he did. I believe that the absolute destruction of Kumasi, with its great palace, the wonder of Western Africa, would be a much more striking and effective end to the war than any paper treaty that I might obtain from this brutal and deceitful monarch. Now, before the British destroy the palace, they loot it systematically. And Wolseley appoints what he calls prize agents who work through the night to strip it of its most valuable gold. And they work by candlelight. And if any of you have heard of Henry Brackenby, who goes on to be a pretty important Victorian soldier, he's one of the prize agents. So is, I think, Redvers Buller, who ends up commanding the British Army in the Anglo-Boer War. And they leave very graphic accounts of what they saw and what they did. And that is then auctioned amongst the British officers, and indeed amongst the Cape Coast elite, mainly Fanti people, a few days later, back down in Cape Coast Castle, because Wolseley does not hang around. He gets in, he destroys, he loots, and he moves out quickly. He thinks he's made his statement. And so the officers buy up what they can, They spend a combined total of £3,560, we think, in this auction. And the money is to go to a welfare fund for the bereaved, for the injured, for the widows, and so on the British side, of course. In Wolseley's mind, and we might talk about this later, there is a distinction, of course, between organised prize, which is good, and disorganised plunder, which is bad. He has been physically present at perhaps the two most notorious moments of imperial plunder in the 19th century up until that point. He was in Lucknow in 1858. He was in Peking in 1860. He has seen both times, and he reflects at length on what he has seen and how it leads to an army a breakdown in discipline, and what's wrong with that. And then he writes, indeed, about the correct ways in which one can take loot from a defeated army. So there's a fair amount of thought that goes into this process. He comes back to Britain and gets a hero's reception. That's Queen Victoria meeting the soldiers on the right. And on the left, you can see what is rather grandly called the royal umbrella, taken from the palace, which has been presented in person to Queen Victoria a few weeks later, and then it is put in the lobby there of the South Kensington Museum, today, of course, the V&A Museum. And Victorian society is mingling around. And as I said, there is a delay in communication. All of this takes about 3 weeks, the news of all this, to reach Britain. In fact, there's been a general election going on in Britain. Gladstone is no longer the Prime Minister. Disraeli is the Prime Minister by the time the British come back. There's been a royal wedding. Was it Prince Alfred has married somebody from the Russian royal family? British attention has been elsewhere, but belatedly, this becomes the story of the spring. And there is huge excitement. And just go back through the archives of the Illustrated London News and the Graphic, and the number of pictures and photographs and articles devoted to the Wolseley War is quite extraordinary. Now, Wolseley said when he left the Cape Coast, when he left the Gold Coast, he'd never been so happy to leave anywhere in his life. But he returns to Britain a superstar. And of course, he eventually becomes Commander-in-Chief of the whole British Army. He's granted an award of £25,000. That's about £3 million today, voted, I think, unanimously by Parliament. And he becomes a kind of hero of popular consciousness. The phrase, all Sir Garnet, enters the British lexicon. Not many of us use that phrase today, but it means everything very well organised, everything very well done. And of course, when George Grossmith takes to the stage in The Pirates of Penzance in 1888 and sings the very model of a modern Major General, his moustache and his mannerisms delight the London crowd because it is a winking allusion to Sir Garnet Wolseley himself. So Wolseley becomes an absolute hero out of this war. In fact, in Ghana today, it is still called the Sagranti War. Sir Garnet Wolseley, Sagranti, so the local pronunciation. So the legacy is there very much today. Let's talk a little bit more about the loot, because there's been something else which has happened while the British were in Kumasi. On their way back down the coast, the Asantehini's envoys catch up with the retreating British and say, okay, we will surrender and we'll sign these pretty humbling terms, basically, which essentially acknowledge that subsidiary kingdoms within the Asante kingdom can leave, that the British can trade wherever they want. We are going to hand over 50,000 ounces of gold. They don't quite do that, and we recognize, that you, the British, are our friends from now on. The envoys catch up with Sir Garnet Wolseley, and they sign this treaty, and they hand over what are called the indemnity treasures. I mean, we might call this today extortion, but it is, in Victorian minds, the indemnity which is paid, almost like the Ashanti guarantee of good behaviour, if I could put it in those terms. These indemnity treasures are kept separate from those looted in the palace, which are sold at Cape Castle. The indemnity treasures are taken straight back to London, and they are exhibited at Garrard, the Crown Jewellers, Haymarket, Piccadilly, the most fashionable location in London, in the spring of 1874. In fact, Queen Victoria takes her pick first, but thereafter they go here. And aristocrats, minor members of the royal family all jostle to make their purchases. It is a prestigious moment. These are some of the items which are still in the royal collection today. Others head in different directions. Yes, of course, the big museums, the British Museum and still the South Kensington, the V&A, take their pick. They're a little bit slow, a little bit frustrated, because a man called Richard Wallace of the Wallace collection, the illegitimate son of the 4th Earl of Hertford, extremely wealthy man, he sees the prestige and the opportunity to buy up, and he, in fact, spends more than anyone else at Garrard's, the Crown Jewellers, and he buys that extraordinary golden head on the left. Some people think it is the largest piece of gold, of sculpted, decorated gold, as it were, to have come out of Africa, with the exception of Egypt. Other items follow a more discreet path. There are a group of officers from the Royal Artillery with Brackenbury who took part in the looting of the palace, and they are allowed to keep this golden head. It is jealously guarded by the Royal Artillery in their officers' mess. They did not allow me to see it, but I was able to obtain a photo of it. So there you are. I think it's the most extraordinary object. And by the way, it sits next to a large silver cross, which the same officer, William Knox, looted from Magdala 6 years earlier. Which is all by means of saying that while our museums might be in the firing light on some of these issues, there are other institutions as well which have kept a lower profile. The National Army Museum has some items, of course, as well. It's Wolseley's private collection, most of which, in fact, he bought at the auction, which he helped organize in Cape Castle, then passed on by his widow, Louisa, to Russi, and then given to the National Army Museum in 1963. And those objects are in storage in Stevenage. So that's the story of 1874. It is not the end of the Anglo-Ashanti story, because in 1896, a second British army enters Kumasi, and the differences this time are that it enters unopposed. The Ashanti have been gravely weakened by the invasion of 1874, and some of those changes which I alluded to in British policy really have taken place by the 1890s. We are in the high noon of the scramble for Africa, the aggressive grabbing of territory. Joseph Chamberlain, of course, is the colonial secretary. Again, keeping the French and the Germans out is the priority. And by this time, the British have determined that they don't want a pliant Ashanti. They want to rule Ashanti. They want to incorporate it into the Gold Coast. Prempeh, who is the king of the Ashanti, the Asantehene at the time, he urges his army not to fight, to accept the surrender, and he is forced to grovel. And here he is with the Queen Mother kissing the feet of Sir Francis Scott and Maxwell, the governor, and another British officer. It doesn't stop him being taken away into exile for 28 years, nor does it stop the British from looting the palace a second time, the rebuilt palace. Perhaps one of the most extraordinary items which they take is the mysterious Ashanti ewer. Some of you might know it. It's in the British Museum, and it is one item, one of several items perhaps, which bring an unexpected degree of perhaps moral complexity to this story. It is the largest surviving bronze vessel from medieval England. Yes, that's right. It has the coat of arms of the English royal family and medieval regalia, and it has an inscription in Middle English around its side. It might date from the reign of Richard II. What on earth was it doing, along with two smaller, apparently medieval English jugs, in the palace in Kumasi? We don't know. Rather incredibly, there is a photograph of it located in situ from 1884, taken by an enterprising photographer from Accra, a man who describes himself of African descent, Frederick Grant, who took that photo of these two objects. So that's an extraordinary story. Perhaps traded by the Portuguese along the coast. It's several hundred years older than the Ashanti Kingdom itself. Perhaps a bit more romantically, it crossed over the Sahara Desert. There will be an exhibition at the British Museum this spring about the Ashanti Ewe, and there are people there who are more learned than I, but it was one of many incredible rabbit holes that one could fall down in this Anglo-Ashanti story. And here, in fact, is another object which the National Army Museum received from the 1896 loot, and it was taken by Robert Baden-Powell, yes, him, later the hero of Mafeking and the founder of the Boy Scouts, but a colonel in the 1896 invasion. And to the Ashanti, this is another sacred object, like the golden stool. It came down from the sky, and it now sits in a warehouse at the very, very top. I was climbing a ladder by the A1, and it's about 1.20 meters in diameter. So I do think there are complexities in this whole restitution debate, but seeing it there, I just had an overwhelming sense of absurdity. What on earth was it doing there when it means so much to some other people? Here's Prempeh on his way to the Seychelles. I've written 27 years. I think I should have said 28. Of course, the Seychelles, a very, very useful place for the British. He will be a prisoner of geography there. There's not much escaping. In fact, while he's there, he kind of becomes anglicized in the course of those long years. He starts to call himself Edward. He goes to church. In fact, while he's at church, he sits next to the king of Buganda and the king of Bonyoro, other troublesome African kings who the British needed to park in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Now, all of these stories are very well known to the Ashanti, but perhaps not so well known to us. Do we also know, in fact, that the British also sent troublesome politicians, chiefs, and so on from Somaliland, Nyasaland, Aden, Egypt, Palestine, the Maldives, Malaysia, and Cyprus to the Seychelles at different times? Even now, the story of Anglo-Ashanti War is not quite over, because the final conflict is the 1900-1901 war, often called in Britain the War of the Golden Stool, if we refer to it at all, sometimes rather dryly called the Fifth Anglo-Ashanti War, but in Ghana known as the Ya Asantewaa War, because she is the great Ashanti queen. She's actually from Ejusi, about just outside Kumasi, who leads the resistance. And this is after Frederick Hodgson, who was the British governor at the time, has marched into Kumasi and said, "Where is the golden stool?" Remember the golden stool? Why am I not sitting on the golden stool at this moment? Well, remember, no one is meant to sit on the golden stool. It was an arrogant and blasphemous demand, according to Adubwahen, who was a great historian of the Ashanti. And I think it is the catalyst for the protracted, the bloody Anglo-Ashanti War. I do rather love this photograph, despite the macabre circumstances under which it's taken. It's in the siege of the Kumasi fort, and these are the British officers and their wives and some missionaries, and they look as if they're posing for an Edwardian tea party. But by this stage, they are eating rats and crows, if they are lucky, and people all around them are dying. But in the end, Ya Asantewaa is defeated. She too is sent to the Seychelles, where she dies. But the British never get the golden stool. Ashanti endures. Prempeh is allowed to return in 1924. And of course, the British are very good at co-opting local elites in their empire. And the Ashantihini and the stool are still revered today. I'll just jump right forward. This is a photo, I think, from the 1930s, which is the official restoration of the Ashanti Confederacy. And we'll go right forward to February of 2024. And if anyone's very alert, they'll recognize this is the 150th anniversary of Sir Garnet Wolseley's invasion of Kumasi. And something has changed. The dialogue around colonial loot has changed in museums. But in fact, it isn't a British museum or a British institution which leads the way. It is an American museum. It's the Fowler Museum of UCLA, which has identified 7 royal objects taken by Wolseley, and that is a curator from the Fowler Museum, returning them to Kumasi 150 years to the day, in fact, from when they were taken. A few months later, in May of 2024, there was a homecoming celebration, as the Ashanti call it, at the Mancha Palace, which is the palace of the Asantehene. And this was a very historic moment when the British Museum, and I think I'm right in saying that this is the first time that the British Museum has ever returned, albeit on loan, we can come to that in a moment, objects taken by force during the colonial period. Although they were so quiet about it, you wouldn't really have known what a historic moment it was. The V&A were there too, and they were perhaps more adept around the publicity of what was happening. Anyway, 32 objects are returned in all to the Mancha Palace Museum. These are photographs I took these days. Almost all looted in the wars, but the British Museum rather cleverly included, in fact, one of the gold gifts which had been given to Thomas Bowdich back in 1817. And it's worth saying that at that stage, Osei Bonsu, the then Asantehene, specifically gave it to him to be shown in the national repository so people should know what my kingdom is. So that's a lovely, touching element to the story. This is the Mancha Palace Museum in Kumasi. And here is returned regalia on display in Kumasi. Priceless treasures from leading British museums now languish in a remote local gallery in Ghana, wrote the Daily Mail. This is only a small proportion, of course, of what was taken, but the Asantehene and his envoys were able to choose the objects they wanted. This was a sword, a sacred sword, the Mpomponsu sword, which caused a lot of excitement. That was taken in 1896, and that is back in Kumasi now. You'll see that they're all kept in museum pieces. They're all kept in museum cases. This is one of the conditions of the loan, alarmed, air conditioning, all the rest of it. So it's an interesting discussion as well about how the meaning of objects changes. These were once, if you like, living spiritual objects that have been used in festivals. Well, their meaning has changed, and they're there on loan, of course, because of the restrictions, which for better or for worse, prevent our national collections from making permanent retains. So that pertains, of course, to the British Museum and the V&A. But I think, rather than just thinking of this as a story of pillage and plunder, I think it's also a story of endurance and continuity. Here's a picture I took of the Asantehene at a festival in Kumasi in November of 2024. In fact, that is celebrating the centenary of Prempeh's return from the Seychelles. And for anyone who has the good fortune to see such a festival in Kumasi and all the noise and the blunderbusses blasting away and the cacophony of horns, it's actually not so different from what Thomas Bowdich described in 1817 when this whole story in all its drama and tragedy began. So that's a quick resume of the extraordinary story of the Anglo-Ashanti Wars and how it fits into some of the debates around our museums. But I think we've got 15 minutes, so I'm very happy to take any questions.